Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we'll explore the key moves made by Trump in regions such as the Middle East, Ukraine, Europe, and Latin America. We'll examine how these actions reflect his broader America First doctrine, highlighting common themes and strategies that underpin his decisions across these diverse regions. We'll also take a historical perspective, comparing Trump's foreign policy actions to those of previous U.S. presidents. We'll also look at global reactions to Trump's policies and their impact on international relations. My guest for this episode is Cyrus Schayegh, professor and chair of the International History and Politics Department here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Cyrus, welcome once again to What Matters Today. It's always great having you on the show. And I'm just going to jump in with the first question as usual. So what are the key foreign policy moves made by Trump in regions such as the Middle East, Ukraine, Europe, and Latin America? And how do these moves reflect the broader America First doctrine, including any common themes or strategies that underpin his foreign policy decisions across these different regions?
First, thanks so much, Dan, as always, for having me. I should also preface what I'm going to say by arguing that now more than ever, having a sort of a deeper historical perspective, I think is really important to understand what's going on right now.
Yep.
So let me start by simply making a very simple statement, which is that I think Trump is at one and the same time a geoeconomic continentalist and a geoeconomic globalist and a geopolitical continentalist.
Okay.
I will unpack what this means just in a second. Before I do so, let me say a second thing, which is that while Trump certainly doesn't have a master plan, he is, I think, going in a sort of a general direction.
Right.
So sometimes we think all he's doing is totally haphazard and all over the place. I actually don't think this is the case. Yeah? But this doesn't add up to some grand master plan that's true either. So let me decode what I mean. Let me first simply say the following. He is a geopolitical continentalist in the sense that he thinks that the overall security of the United States doesn't go much farther, with some exceptions, but much farther than, I think, the Northern American continent. This is a huge change from how US presidents for the last 8 decades have seen the world. He is geoeconomically a globalist, in the sense that he sees American interests and opportunities all around the globe. As you can, I'm sure, already guess, there are some tensions built into these two different sort of stances. So let me give you some examples, okay? Which countries have been really at the receiving end of Trump's moves in the last, few weeks? Canada, Mexico also in the sense that he wants to call the Gulf of Mexico Gulf of America, Denmark/Greenland, the Panama Canal. These have been amongst the biggest and actually the only real direct targets of what Trump wants to either incorporate into the United States, which is true, that's not going to happen, or where he wants to directly expand American influence. All of these territories lie within very broadly defined the Northern American continent, right? Not beyond. This is where they lie.
Yep.
Anything else has either been not that important, or if it has been important, and by this I mean, for instance, Gaza and for instance, the Ukraine, if it has been important in the sense that Trump tries to actually allow either bigger other powers like Russia or middle powers such as Israel and Saudi Arabia to basically do more before than they wanted. He is also interested in some deal with Iran. So there, when it comes to anywhere beyond North America, right, largely defined, he is happy to be actually more modest, which is a weird word you would normally not associate with Trump, geopolitically speaking, right? He basically tries to pull back for economic opportunities, right? So he talks about the deal with Russia in the Arctic. He talks about some deal in Gaza, etc., right? That's the tit for tat. He also has pulled the United States out of key multilateral institutions, right? So we all know WHO is just one very good example. Mm-hmm. Also, the World Trade Organization is another really good example. This is a very big change in US security doctrine as well, because let's be very clear, the United States didn't for decades support these institutions just out of the goodness of their own heart, but rather because they felt, Republican and Democratic presidents alike, administrations alike, felt that these institutions help protect the globally defined security needs of the United States. So the fact that Trump doesn't see those issues as directly endangering or being relevant to US security needs anymore is basically the international organization's parallel to his belief that geopolitically, the United States interests, security-wise, the United States' biggest interests are basically containable to the North American continent. Third point that I would make here is the fact that he is also trying to force certain smaller countries, like Taiwan, for instance, to locate or to relocate some of their economic production, particularly when it's really high-tech stuff, into the United States. That also sort of, works, I think, suits this pattern that we start to see here. Again, the pattern being him being a geo-economic globalist, but a geopolitical continentalist, right? So when he thinks that something is really security-wise critical for the United States, and highest end chips are produced, for instance, in Taiwan, then he would like those chips production to not be outside the Northern American hemisphere. He wants it to be at least partly located in the United States, right? So it all sort of fits this broad direction, right? So let me now get to my next point, which would be to say that it seems to me that the bottom line here that we're seeing is that Trump is geopolitically much more modest than earlier US presidents, but he is geoeconomically much more rapacious and much more ready to throw around the United States' weight in order to open markets, basically force other players to play by Americans' ball, etc., etc. So it's a very weird mixture, right, between more modesty on the one side and much more aggression on the other side. Europe is a weird in-between case here, I feel, and NATO is as well. I think the Americans don't quite know what to do with the Europeans. They haven't made up their mind about a lot of things, but I think Europe is the biggest problem they have. Why is this? I think it is because they, on the one side, do think that they can do without Europe, but on the other side, there is this sense that perhaps that is a bit too much of a stretch. And you see this going back and forth between these two positions, or rather these positions existing simultaneously extremely well in the Ukrainian crisis case, right? So on the one side, there is full-on aggression against the Europeans, also ideologically. But this aggression can also, like, for instance, Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference.
Right.
But this aggression can also be read as a defensive move in the sense that the United States can't just ignore what's going on in Europe. So, which they could. They could just ignore the Europeans like they ignore a lot of other people, right? But rather than ignoring them, they feel that they are important enough. And so they basically want to turn them into clones of the ideological clones of the US. This shows that they are actually concerned about what Europe could do against the US, right? So it's an aggressive move with a defensive undertow, right? Let me now get to the last bit of my answer to your first question, which concerns possible problems with this approach. And there are a huge number of problems, right? Any sort of broader approach by a very big power like the United States necessarily creates tensions and inconsistencies. This is no exception, right? One thing that could happen is that sooner or later, the geopolitical globalists within the US administration and maybe also within the military, and I'm sure there are lots of those left, right, will start to organize and push back. What this would mean, I don't know. Something that definitely will happen, because it always does, is unintended consequences of this geopolitical continentalist stance, or to put it differently, Trump's belief that it makes economic sense and is okay security-wise for the United States to turn American security needs to make them a little bit smaller, right? To basically make them more continental than they were before. Before they were much more global. So what can some of these unintended consequences be? One is, for instance, that we will have a new epidemic, a worldwide epidemic, right? In which case the United States and also the world as a whole will be much less prepared. And some people will rightly see this as partly a consequence of Americans' basically withdrawal. A second consequence that definitely will happen is that smaller states will start to hedge, because they will be less protected by the United States. So they will start to hedge and basically try to get closer to other big powers. In Southeast Asia, this might be China, right? And this right now may not really matter to the Americans, but it may become a problem, for them. Another thing that I think will possibly happen is that in parallel to hedging, is that a few states may start to develop nuclear weapons. I think in South Korea, this conversation is already way underway. And I would not be surprised that if the United States really does start to seriously withdraw troops from Europe, and if it really does force Ukraine into a deal that is not acceptable to Ukraine and Europe, that some states in Europe will start to think seriously about nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are a cheap way of holding a big contrahend like Russia at bay, right? Mm-hmm. It's cheaper, it's relatively fast, it can be done relatively fast in the European case if you have the technology. Another problem with the fact that Trump's administration is geoeconomically a globalist sort of power, but geopolitically a continental power, or not power, but it has a continental sort of, approach, concerns the question where the North American continent actually ends. So we already have seen this problem with NATO. So the Northern Atlantic is sort of where does it exactly end? So Europe is this issue. On the other side, on the eastern side, there is the Pacific. And of course, the very big, question is, where will American interests end and Chinese interests start? And this is a very old question, by the way, right? A really, really old question that goes all the way into the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And I do think that perhaps there will be friction points with the Chinese. Even if the United States throw Taiwan under the bus, and they, like extreme case, allow China to take over Taiwan, that will start to, they may be friction points there, right? Yet another consequence that we already start to see happening is that all sorts of third states who are under the United States pressure start to either politically or at this point more trade-wise align, right? So we have the Mercosur agreement that the EU is trying to, do. It's the agreement that the EU is trying to do with Mexico. There will be all sorts of different, attempts to basically get around the United States, and this may have effects on the United States, right? Then we have the effects of trade wars, if they will actually happen. So that's yet another one, right? And there are like yet other ones, but I think at this point, it perhaps makes sense to just move on to the next question. But before I do so, let me return one more time to the basic argument I'm making, which is that Trump definitely doesn't have a grand, detailed master plan. He's no Kissinger. But I do think that the different moves he's making, although they may seem disjointed and sometimes harebrained, actually do point in a general direction. And that general direction is, as I mentioned before, a new way of understanding the relationship between American geopolitical security interests, which now are defined much more continentally, and geoeconomic interests, which continue to be defined globally, and which in actual fact are more aggressively defined economically than before, right? And the big question will be, where are tensions between these two things? How does the fact that the United States will definitely continue to have bases all around the world, maybe less so than before, but it will still have these bases. How does this play into the tension between these two approaches?
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. And you touched on this very briefly where you talked about how Trump is a bit different than some of the previous presidents. So let's dig deeper into that. And from a historical perspective, how do Trump's foreign policy actions compare to those of previous U.S. presidents?
Let me just go through a couple of points that seem to me to be really important. Trump's approach accelerates and makes much more radical a move that even earlier U.S. presidents, and I mean specifically Biden or Obama, had started to go into, both on the geopolitical end and on the geoeconomic end, right? But I would say it's more change than continuity, but there are certain elements of continuity here as well, or there are certain roots that we see. I think we can maybe talk about roots, right? So Trump had started in his first presidency to move the US out of the WTO, or to minimalize the US stance in the WTO. Biden continued to do this, right? They're basically blocking the WTO. Geoeconomically, Biden wasn't aggressive, but he started to think about how the United States should work economically in somewhat different ways than the true globalists, had done before, right? And in ways that are a bit more aggressive in certain cases, but there are also lots of other cases. I think the clear route is perhaps in geopolitics. A number of American presidents in the 21st century tried to sort of execute a pivot to Asia, right? And that meant that they tried to somehow downsize American commitments in Europe and American commitments in the Middle East. Trump builds on that move, makes it much more radical, makes it much more extreme, but he basically builds on this move. Not that he wants, I really think, to do a pivot to Asia and confront China. I actually don't think right now that's how it looks like. But he builds on the drawing back move that have been out a little bit out of Europe, a little bit out of the Middle East that we have seen already. So that's one thing. The second thing is a really clear change. And this is something that I mentioned before, which is the fact that since the 1940s, some people would say since the late 1930s, the United States has defined its security in ever broader, geographically ever broader terms. By the later 1940s, or definitely by the 1950s, basically in one way or another, the entire globe became a zone of American security interest. And these had huge consequences, and it posed many, many problems because it also led to overextension, amongst other things, right? And although there were ebbs and flows and ups and downs, some regions sometimes were more important than the US and sometimes were a bit less. Broadly speaking, I would argue this view that different areas around the whole world, in one way or another, are directly affecting American security, broadly defined, this is really now, I think, changing. I really think this is the biggest change that we see. There is an interesting root in Trump's aggressive geoeconomic rapacious behavior. And that root is America's willingness after the Second World War and all the way until quite recently to see trade not as a zero-sum game, but rather as potentially mutually beneficial. You saw this best and earliest in the way in which the United States conditioned Marshall Plan aid to post-World War II destroyed Europe on Europe opening its own trade borders, allowing American trade in, but also being able to trade into the United States more than before. So the Americans saw mutual trade as something that adds not only to their profit margin, but also adds to their security. So they thought in win-win terms. And these win-win terms, certainly by the 1960s, from the 1960s onwards, also create situations where, yes, once, the big blocks of industrial production in the world outside the US mainland, namely East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and also Western Europe, once those had really recovered from the Second World War, they started to export more into the United States, which posed problems for the US. Mm-hmm. But these were problems that a lot of people in the US were somewhat fine accepting, because overall, bottom line, it seemed to them that the US still had a good deal here. And I think that's true. They definitely still had a good deal. Mm. But Trump, already in the 1980s, perhaps even before, but we know this already in the 1980s, Trump thought that this is not win-win. So when he saw all these Japanese and German cars in the US in the 1980s and, Japanese video recorders and television, etc., in the 1980s already, he thought this is not okay. Yeah. So his approach, he's much more aggressive, not win-win, but win-lose, or whatever. We need to win. And if you win, good for you. But, if you lose, too bad. That approach is not new for him at all.
Right. Yeah.
It actually is a particular reading of a Cold War American approach to what American security politically defined and economically defined should look like.
So what have been the global reactions to Trump's foreign policy, and how have these reactions influenced international relations?
I think some bits of the answer I have talked about above, right? And some of this we already are starting to see. So, certain weaker third states starting to hedge, a greater potential move towards nuclear weapons, a number of third states starting to tighten their trade relations and basically sidestepping the United States, which is a form of hedging as well in a certain sense. These are all reactions. There are other reactions too on the European end, definitely right now, a sort of head-spinning confusion mixed with the determination to really now push beyond although it is also clear that different European countries see an either still greater American role in Europe vis-a-vis a smaller American role in Europe.
Yeah.
Right? It's very interesting to see who sees what, right? It's also very clear that bigger powers and middle powers have, relatively speaking, more to gain here, while smaller powers have a lot to fear. And also regular people, both in the United States, but also around the world, have a lot to fear and are already suffering. Like we already see this. We see the effects of the closing down of US aid, in effect, the closing down of US aid. All these things have already started to affect people, right? How this will affect Trump, we will see. I don't think we can make clear predictions, but I do think that right now, he is under the mistaken assumption that he will be able to call the shots forever. But that is never the case. It just is not. And it probably will not take much longer than the end of this year for some clear patterns to emerge, right? And then we will see what he's going to do, what sort of trade-offs he will actually find acceptable to himself, right?
Thanks for that answer. And for my final question, how might future historians view Trump's foreign policy legacy, especially in terms of its impact on global stability and US influence?
I think, historians, one way historians love to think about the past is in terms of continuity versus change. And I can totally see future historians debating quite rigorously and vigorously over the question which parts of Trump's shifts are more rooted and which parts are less rooted in earlier administration's policies, right? And I think one can, as I said, I think one can make a solid case that certain bits of his geopolitical approach have some roots, and that maybe a very few bits of his geoeconomic move also have some roots as well. But my sense is that people will see this as the tipping and turning point. Exactly how radical of a turning point remains to be seen. But I don't think we will just see a version of the old in a couple of more years. I think this will really be, we are really entering into, I think, into a new age in world affairs.
Great. Thank you very much, Cyrus. As always, great having you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.